All right, welcome everyone. Perhaps you're watching on Facebook in Digestion Solutions for Women with Autoimmune Gut Issues. It's Thursday, October 28th, 2021 at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. This is my live guest interview workshop with the lovely Tracy Reed, who I will introduce here in a moment. For those of you tuning into this guest workshop on Facebook, and for those joining us here live on Zoom who are new to my community and new to interacting with myself, let alone anyone else, through a live training like this one. I'm Jessica Pecush. I'm based here in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, but coming to you live from Edmonton tonight. I'm a gut-focused culinary and holistic nutrition practitioner who helps professional-driven women like yourselves repair their gut, regain their energy, and reclaim their personal and professional lives. These are women who are struggling with autoimmune-based gut issues like celiac disease, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis, but also gut issues in the absence of autoimmunity as well. I help you step into transformation and out of ongoing inflammation and ongoing inconvenient, painful, and uncomfortable symptoms by helping you to step into that transformation and take control of your health in all of the most suitable ways, diet and lifestyle based, that help you keep inflammation at bay and feel your very best. And I help you through my 4-month online coaching program, The Digestion Method. Tonight, I'm joined by the lovely Tracy Reed, a gut-focused certified holistic nutritional consultant as well, based in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Tracy and I first met in September of 2016. I was just thinking about this earlier when I attended the Canadian School of Natural Nutrition here in Calgary, Alberta. She was one of the instructors at the time who guided me through that program. She continues to mentor all kinds of nutritional professionals at that school on a continuous basis, including now. And she is one of the 2 co-founders of Histamine Haven, a resource and recipe book in focusing on all things histamine intolerance and mast cell activation disorders. So she is an expert in all that she does. So Tracy, I'd love to welcome you here tonight. Happy to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Excited to be here, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So tonight we're going to do a little back and forth Q&A amongst ourselves and the questions that are fed through the chat here about all things histamine intolerance, and helping you, our audience, this community of women, to help yourself make connections, help yourself discover those missing links for yourself, and help to learn about the supports available to you that help you close the gaps with your nutritional and lifestyle care, and what we can also tap into with the medical side of things from the appropriate types of practitioners as well. So Tracy, I'd love for you to further introduce yourself as you'd like to before we get started. If you'd like to tell us a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and Histamine Haven, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so as Jessica mentioned, I'm a nutritional consultant, one of the instructors at the Canadian School of Natural Nutrition here in Calgary. But early on in my practice, I started attracting some very complex cases, and I was kind of thrown into the deep end. And it was through working with some of these clients that I started to kind of question some symptoms that I had myself. And so I am now a practitioner for people with histamine and mast cell mediated health conditions, but I am also a patient with mast cell activation syndrome. So I know this very personally and know it professionally from working with people. And as I was kind of going through the process of helping clients, I already had recognized that there were no good resources available. And then when I became a patient, when I was diagnosed with mast cell activation syndrome, that was really the impetus for me to start to create some resources. And that's what Histamine Haven is all about. And we've been working hard with a colleague of mine, Luca Simmons. So she's my partner on that whole project. Oh, Jessica, I think you've muted.
I did. Thank you, Tracy. I didn't want to make any noise while you were speaking. Thank you. Thank you for telling us more about your journey and you know, how you arrived at where you are today and what's on the go at your end with your practice. Really looking forward to diving into this topic tonight. So how about we get started? Sound good?
Yes.
All right. Let's start with sharing with these women what histamine is, essentially. So we have a solid understanding of what this is in terms of this naturally occurring chemical that could or could not be causing us issues
yes,
and symptoms and inflammation.
So histamine is a compound in the body, and most people, if they've ever heard of it, have heard of it in relationship to allergies. So people know that when they have an allergic reaction, they take an antihistamine. But histamine is really, really vital. It's needed for a whole bunch of functions in the body, namely kind of immune function, gut function. I think 23 different functions have been identified in the body. Now, one of the ones that's really important from a digestive perspective is that histamine is involved in smooth muscle contraction. And smooth muscle in the body, your GI tract is one place where you have smooth muscle. So if you think of your GI tract and that, like that motility, that action that's going to move food through, and eventually you'll poop out that food, that motility is signaled by histamine. So smooth muscle contraction in the gut, in the lungs, in our like capillaries, it's happening all over the body. So lots of functions. Also can dilate blood vessels. Mm-hmm. So think like low blood pressure. So it's doing a lot. It's really, really important in our bodies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so what physiologically happens when there's too much in the body? Like, how does it come to be that there might be too much in the body, and what might someone experience when this is off kilter or
so
on awry a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really, I'm going to pull up some slides.
Sure, absolutely. Go for it. We're ready.
It's a big question. So when there's too much, the short answer is you will develop symptoms, and the symptoms are incredibly broad ranging, and can, like, literally any symptom that you can think of has the potential. It doesn't mean it will be, but it has the potential to be histamine mediated. So let me just share a few slides here, because there's so many symptoms. It can be a little bit hard to keep track of them all.
Yeah, for sure.
So as I go through these symptoms, I would actually encourage people to think about these symptoms in relation to themselves, or maybe somebody else that they're thinking of in their life. And the interesting thing with histamine mediated symptoms is that they can wax and wane. So when you think about these symptoms in relationship to yourself, think about, have you ever in your past had these symptoms? So not just currently, but have you ever had them? So skin, we have a lot of histamine mediated symptoms that can happen in the skin. Flushing is one of the, I guess, sort of telltale signs. So for people who flush, get red in the face when they're embarrassed, or when they've had alcohol, that is a pretty good indicator that histamine is involved. If you've ever had hives or rashes or eczema, often people that have histamine issues will get hives sometimes, and they just don't know why. And then the hives will go away. Some people can be itchy, and that can be without any like noticeable rashes or anything. Some people will sweat excessively. Some people will have swelling, and it's different from normal swelling in that it can actually move throughout the body. And then if you are that person who gets a mosquito bite and gets like a bigger welt or has more irritation than you think, other people are having, that can also be a sign. Now, one of the signs that is there's a very strong correlation to histamine, it's called dermatographism. And dermatographism, it can look different from person to person, but basically you can, in its extreme form, you can develop a welt. So in the image on the slide, you see the inside of the forearm, and that's, sensitive skin in there. So if you were to take, I don't have one here, but if you were to take a pen with a blunt edge on it, or you could, if your fingernails aren't very sharp, or even if you had something like a popsicle stick, and if you were to just run it with moderate pressure along the inside of your arm, and then just watch, my histamine's under control, so I will not get dermatographism today. But if a pink line starts to emerge, pink or red, or even a white line, Or worst case scenario is these welts that you see here in this image. That is very highly correlated to histamine. And then you can watch that spot for about 10 minutes. Usually it lingers for a while, so it won't go away quickly. You can have all kinds of respiratory things. So think asthma, think like congestion or drippy nose, or maybe you're that person who can't breathe through your mouth at night. And histamine also acts as a neurotransmitter. So that means it can impact the brain and the nervous system. So headaches or migraines, some people have their migraines are purely histamine mediated. You can have things like dizziness, anxiety, and even depression can be linked to histamine. You may have nerve issues like numbness, tingling, pain. You might have concentration or memory problems. You might have problems sleeping. And typically you would, if you have histamine issues, certainly this is my experience anyway, I say typically, this is what happens to me. I'll fall asleep at night, but I'll wake up after about an hour, hour and a half, and then I'm awake for hours. And so that happens with me if I've had a high histamine meal for dinner. And then also you can have some sensitivities to smells or sounds or light. So for people who are struggling with chemical sensitivities, that is a good indicator that histamine might be involved. You can have reproductive. So Jess, I'm assuming your audience is entirely women. So like
that's
painful,
right.
yeah,
right.
Painful cramps with your periods, pain with urination, or anything bladder related, like overactive bladder, irritable bladder, where you have to pee frequently. Some people, some women will also get pelvic pain. So there's a condition called interstitial cystitis that is quite painful, and that's related to histamine as well. Now, digestive, this is why everybody's here today. So digestive symptoms, you can sometimes have nausea with or without vomiting. And remember, these symptoms can wax and wane. So you may have had bouts of low-grade nausea in your life. Heartburn and reflux are important ones. So histamine signals acid production in the stomach. So if you have high acidity in your stomach, then it could be a sign that you have high histamine. And so often people will have a lot of problems with reflux. Not everybody does. And I should say, I should have said this at the beginning, you can have only like a few symptoms from this whole profile that I'm going through. You can maybe just have a few symptoms, and some people will have a whole bunch of symptoms. So it looks really, really different from person to person. One person might have GI symptoms and migraines. Another person might have like skin issues and fatigue. So it can be very, very broad ranging. And this is why it's really confusing, and why historically, like, we're starting to learn a lot about this now, but doctors didn't know what was going on when people had, you know, this kind of mixed up symptom profile that didn't match any kind of diagnosis. Other really significant ones from a digestive perspective, you could have diarrhea sometimes, IBS types of symptoms. And in fact, I think 11% of IBS is correlated to histamine. You can have abdominal pain and also food allergies. You can have cardiac things like heart palpitations, arrhythmia, and low blood pressure is another one that can be quite problematic. Chest pain. Pain shows up a lot. So abdominal pain, chest pain, you know, headache pain, it can be joint pain. It can show up anywhere. And again, you don't have to have pain, but this would be part of the profile. Muscle and joint pain, muscle twitching, hypermobility. So there is actually a condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome where people, it's genetic, where they have hypermobility in their joints, and that's correlated to histamine-mediated symptoms as well. So that's a lot of symptoms, and that's not even exhaustive. Like, the list is really, really long. I just wanted to give you kind of a good sense. And again, the profile is unique. The only criteria really is that it has to be in more than one body system for it to be considered to be histamine mediated.
Yes, that was my next question. Yeah, I can appreciate with such wide-ranging symptoms. Thank you for that, because that can often be the unknown starting point in realizing just how this can manifest to begin with, that trying to whittle down whether this is a histamine issue or not, that's a great starting point. And by the end of this conversation together, we'll offer some next steps as to, you know, how to start exploring this further from here, but that's something important to remember, that's for sure. So where does histamine come from in the body in terms of, we've learned a little bit about how it impacts the body if it's overproduced or not being broken down effectively, but where does it really stem from?
Yeah. So there's basically two main places. It can come from food. So it's sort of part of food. It comes from an amino acid in food called histidine that gets converted to histamine. So we're getting it through our food. And then it can be made and stored in some of our immune cells. So the biggest cell that's involved is called a mast cell. And mast cells are everywhere in the body, and that's why these symptoms show up everywhere in the body, but they're most concentrated in the GI tract, so in your digestive system, in the skin, and in the lungs.
And so in terms of food sources, I know from my research and experience that, you know, many foods contain some amount of histamine, but there are certainly ones that are higher in histamine than others, like our, foods like bone broth that are cooked for many hours at a time and take, you know, up to maybe a few days to reach the point of consumption. Those are certainly going to be higher histamine foods.
Yeah.
Animal proteins, you know, if they're not consumed fresh right away and they're put into the fridge as leftovers, they'll continue to rise in histamine over time. What else had I written down here? Anything aged or cured, raw, unpasteurized ferments. These are some of our higher histamine foods as compared to having histamine to a lesser extent. Would there be any other ones top of mind that should be top of mind right off the bat?
There are, there's some foods that I think are commonly eaten. Strawberries would be one, right? Everybody thinks berries are so rich in antioxidants, so they've got to be good for you. Strawberries are high. Pineapple is another one that's really high. Avocado,
right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, there's these healthy foods. Spinach is another one that's really high. Tomatoes are really high. And so there's some of these foods that really, you know, if you look at anti-inflammatory food lists, you'll find some of these foods on there. Or, you know, when you think of kind of like autoimmune protocols, some of these foods are on those lists. And so they can be quite problematic. But you touched on like the bone broth and the fermented foods. And those, again, like those are really trending. Those are touted as being so healthy for the gut. And I've seen where I've had clients where they've gone to their naturopathic doctors. And again, a lot of people don't know about histamine and mast cell stuff. So their naturopathic doctors, with the best of intentions, are saying, you know, start drinking bone broth, start having fermented foods. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, their health takes a really sharp dive with the consumption of those. So anything aged, as you said, cheeses, you know, smoked meats, anything canned, like canned fish, it just has to be as fresh as you can get it, especially meat. And for meat, Luca and I are always talking about, like, if you can buy it frozen, like if you can buy it from the farmer where it's been slaughtered and frozen right away, that is the best way.
Yeah, these foods certainly have to be tailored to unique circumstances once a practitioner knows the bigger picture, because they can be so supportive in some gut health circumstances, but not others for the time being, perhaps reintroduced in small amounts later on. Absolutely, especially with with SIBO, with candidiasis, depending on whatever the issue might be in terms of overgrowth or infection or some sort of severe or significant imbalance.
And you know, I would say for 85 to 90% of the population, histamine will never be an issue. But that's still, like, that 10 to 15%, that's still a really significant, you know, if you took, like, say 11 people, one of those people is going to have an issue with histamine.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. significant enough to pay attention to. Absolutely.
Yes.
So in terms of, thank you. So in terms of how histamine is connected to digestive issues specifically, you've already touched on that in terms of, the kinds of symptoms we could be experiencing if we have sensitivity or intolerance to the histamine level in our body. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that in terms of its connection to poor gut health or any genetic component or other things that impact poor bacterial balance in the gut overall, like chronic stress or any other contributing factors?
So histamine, so I think, I mentioned histamine comes from mast cells, and mast cells we tend to see a lot of in the GI tract. There are certainly, if you look at the research, and I'm a total research geek, so I'm always looking at the research, but it's histamine or mast cell activation. So when mast cells are activated, they're releasing histamine, is correlated to things like IBS. As I mentioned, about 11% of IBS has mast cell activation as a component, but also Crohn's, colitis, and celiac. So there's mast cell involvement with those GI conditions.
Absolutely. And sometimes when women are describing where their pain and discomfort is within their torso area, it can be hard to distinguish whether it's stomach pain or intestinal pain lower down. Sometimes it just feels like that whole area. If someone's experiencing stomach pain, for example, might histamine be involved there, or might it be lower GI tract symptoms closer to the pelvic region? Or
it can be anywhere.
It could be both.
Yeah, it can be anywhere. So if we're looking at the stomach, that's where we see the stomach acid contributing to that. So again, the reflux, like I have a lot of people who are like, I feel burning up my esophagus or at the back of my throat. If we're talking about the small intestine, that's where something like SIBO can come into play, because SIBO can trigger mast cell activation. And so then you'll have this release of histamine. And so let me put this into perspective with pain, because our mast cells can actually move around the body. So they're made in our bone marrow, and then they travel around the body. And when we're talking about pain is a sensation that you feel with your nerves. And your nerves, when they're signaling pain, that's like a beacon to the immune system. So it's saying, it's the signal to say, I need to call in the immune system. And that's when the mast cells come in. And so then I find it so fascinating, but the nerves and the mast cells communicate with one another. They do something called crosstalk. And so they're sending little messenger molecules back and forth to one another. And that crosstalk, that communication, is actually amplifying the pain response. And so that's why we see sort of some like extreme forms of pain where you might just think like why is there pain there? Like, what is actually driving that pain? And it's just this kind of crosstalk it's perpetuating itself. The mast cells will tell the nerves, like, keep releasing peptides, and the nerves then signal back to the mast cells, like, keep releasing histamine and other inflammatory mediators. And so it just drives that pain response and amplifies it.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, the way you explain it, in terms of that ongoing signaling and communication, driving what you're feeling, driving the symptoms. Very interesting.
Yeah.
And so in terms of histamine, actually, I'll just touch on this before we go into histamine and autoimmunity, in terms of anything else we'd like to say here. But when you mentioned histamine triggering the release of stomach acid for digestion, and when someone's very acidic within their stomach, maybe too much hydrochloric acid. We also have the opposite end of the spectrum with too little stomach acid, which is very commonly tied to acid reflux, unknowingly thinking there's too much acid when there's really too little, and that sort of thing. Would you say histamine could be equally involved in both scenarios, or even have different impacts when someone is having production of too much stomach acid versus too little?
So
does that make sense?
Yeah, typically with histamine, we're going to see the too much stomach acidity, not 100% across the board, but typically, when I think of my clients who are like more severe on the mast cell side of things, because we see like a really, really broad range of severity, they almost always are struggling with reflux and have, some kind of burning issues in the back of the throat, or, even really severe where they're getting damage to their tooth enamel because so much acid is coming up. Other things, some people will just talk about having an ongoing sore throat or having difficulty swallowing. And that's just because that reflux is causing some inflammation in there.
Yeah.
So
damage to that tissue.
Yeah. So most often with histamine, it is going to be that like overactive stomach.
Yeah. Good to know. And so in terms of histamine's involvement in autoimmune conditions where the immune system has gone awry and is attacking, tissue or an organ or a gland, and, with 70% of the immune system being housed in the gut, and the connection to histamine there, is there anything you'd like to add in terms of that histamine autoimmune connection at all beyond what you said already?
Yeah. So one of the things to understand with the mast cells, even though they're kind of housing histamine and they can release histamine, they in fact are housing over 200 different chemical mediators. And so if they are getting the signal to degranulate and release these chemical mediators, there are so many other mediators besides just histamine that are inflammatory. And so they are the most fascinating and complex immune cell. Sometimes they can selectively degranulate. Other times it's like just a more general one. But that is, I think, contributing. And autoimmunity. So here's what's actually happening with the GI autoimmune conditions. So the mast cells, one of those chemical mediators that they're releasing is called interleukin-6. And interleukin-6 has been very, very well researched in terms of inflammation. And with autoimmunity in the GI tract, there are other immune cells called Th17 cells. And with autoimmunity, we see those Th17 cells being in high numbers, proportionate to the other cells. And it's that interleukin-6 that is driving that Th17 to go up. And that the Th17 is very highly correlated to autoimmunity. So that's a cascade. The mast cells are releasing the interleukin-6 that is stimulating the Th17 to go up that we see with these autoimmune conditions.
Okay.
Is that too nerdy?
No, you explain it very well. Because it gets very technical, right? But it's just that cascade ripple effect with the messaging and the signaling within the body that's driving these kinds of responses.
There are some other autoimmune conditions that have been researched to have mast cell involvement as well. Hashimoto's, thyroiditis is one, and lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. So those are all ones that have been researched as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. So in terms of our next topic of discussion here, we've kind of already chatted about this, but I'll just kind of recap what we've said already and go from there, which kind of ties into bringing this to a close as well. In terms of food sources of histamine, we talked about aged cheeses, aged or cured meats, bone broth, caffeine. I'll just add a few more to the list here. Caffeinated teas, chocolate, raw, darn it, raw unpasteurized ferments like sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, miso, dried fruit, tomatoes, tomato-based products, spicy foods, vinegars, pineapple, eggplant, avocado.
And there are a lot of spices, things like cinnamon, and curries are really problematic as well. So one of the things we've tried to do in Histamine Haven is to find like really good replacements for all of those things. Right. So, instead of using spinach, we use arugula in our recipes. Instead of using chocolate, we'll use cocoa butter. So you've got that nice kind of white chocolate, that subtle chocolate flavor. Instead of the bone broth, we have a really low histamine meat stock that we have. So we have tried to create this sense of abundance, where, you know, sometimes people can feel like, oh, there's all these foods I have to avoid, and it can start to feel really restricted. So we've really tried to work hard to create that feeling of abundance.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize that enough, because it really comes down to knowledge and awareness and exposure from the culinary side of things, which is where working with a practitioner like you or I or anyone else is invaluable, because
Yes.
there are things that we just don't know what we don't know. We don't know what's available to us, especially if we're used to eating a certain scope of foods or kind of putting the same things in our grocery cart without knowing, you know, what those other options are, until we've, you know, we're in a circumstance where we're working with them and we're enjoying them because we're now familiar with them. So I know with protocols that I've had with past clients where they've been working through SIBO, some of which have histamine issues, some of which don't. You know, we've worked through things that are SIBO friendly, IBS friendly, but also low histamine friendly, if that's been the case, which is sometimes, but not always. Would you, in terms of those swaps you mentioned, in terms of those higher histamine foods, what does this typically look like in your practice in terms of reintroducing in small amounts later on down the road those higher histamine foods? I mean, that's obviously going to look different for everyone in terms of their gut repair and gut healing process, and when those come into the picture, in what order, and in what kind of a small amount to test for tolerance. But in my experience, it's been, you know, taking that pause, especially during a circumstance where someone's medically working through SIBO as well, to keep things lower histamine, get to a certain stage of gut healing and repair and eradication of that SIBO, for example, before starting to introduce these things in smaller amounts.
Yeah, so what Luke and I did with Histamine Haven was we created a 3-stage protocol. And so our protocol is, it's low histamine, it's gut supporting, it's immune supporting, it's nutrient dense. So for people who are maybe a bit more familiar with some of the like dietary lingo, it's low lectin, it's low mold. I think what we've done that is very unique to any other cookbook is that we have variations in our recipes for low salicylate and low oxalate, and if people are on an autoimmune protocol, because we've done that, because when people have mast cell activation syndrome, they can be reacting to substrates other than just histamine. And so we intentionally created a 3-stage protocol so that people could move through. And the goal of moving through is not to be able to say, oh, I can eat all the foods in this stage. The goal of moving through the stages is to be able to identify which foods are a trigger for me as an individual. And sometimes, you know, like for example, I can eat a little bit of chocolate and I am totally fine. I don't do so well with a dash of cinnamon. So I totally avoid cinnamon. I like to have little bits of chocolate. And that's right. It's so different from person to person. So we really designed this so that it was meant to be a way to discover. In fact, our second stage is called doing the detective work.
Yeah.
So it's meant to be a process for people to discover, you know, these are the foods that I tolerate well. And our stages build on nutrient density. So for example, liver, right? Probably the most nutrient dense food in the planet, but it can be high histamine as well. So it's in our final stage because we feel it's so important, and it has some of these key nutrients, things like copper and vitamin A, that are actually needed to help make the enzyme that breaks histamine down. But you know, it does have high histamine. So towards the end, it's kind of balancing that, like the histamine content versus the nutritive value of that food.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that will look so individual from person to person in terms of tolerance and reintroduction. So in terms of in bringing this to a close here, thank you so much for everything so far. And ladies, if you have any reactions, reflections, comments, feel free to post those in the chat. Once again, what would be some next steps beyond, anecdotally food journaling, things that are proving to be trigger foods, or documenting symptoms, anecdotally for themselves prior to taking that to a practitioner? Are there any other next steps that someone could take in helping to identify for themselves whether histamine is histamine intolerance, overproduction of it, or inefficient breakdown of it in the body is sincerely an issue for them, something worth exploring with a practitioner?
Yeah, so I would say, like, from a very practical perspective, one of the steps you can take in your own kitchen, I've already talked about, like, getting as fresh as you possibly can, but always freezing your leftovers. So leftovers very, very rapidly form histamine. And so those always need to get frozen. So you just put them into like portion size containers and pop them into the freezer, and then they're there and they're ready for whenever you need them. From a practitioner perspective, it is really, really challenging. So many doctors don't know about histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome. Even some of the allergists and immunologists don't know about it. So one of the things that I'm always doing is helping people to kind of navigate the medical system and try to get the help that they need. Because it is so challenging. And, I wish I could say there was like a route to go to explore that. But currently we don't have lab testing available in our medical system. There is lab testing, but it's not done through allopathic medicine. So the functional medicine doctors are doing it, and you can certainly go the functional medicine route, but for most of my clients, they're actually finding me because the functional medicine route is cost prohibitive. It's just so expensive that they can't possibly afford it. So I know that's like probably not the answer you want.
Oh, but that's the reality, right? And there's more than one option out there. There's more than one type of practitioner out there. So, it's building your awareness like you are by listening to this interview tonight as part of our audience, that there are different types of support out there. It's a matter of the first step is always having, like I always say in this community, the women have heard this a number of times, the first step is having a conversation with a qualified practitioner about this, because if we're not talking about it with someone, we're not moving forward, we're staying stuck. So we don't know what's available to us and what any type of practitioner can do for us until we've had a conversation with them to share, what this has looked like up to this point, what we're experiencing, what's working, what's not, what the roadblocks are in moving forward, so that that practitioner at the other end can not only provide some logical next steps as to what kind of supports need to be in place, but also determine whether they're a practitioner that can help you or whether it's best to refer out to someone else. And so, that's part of this guest interview tonight as well, is exposing this community to just yet another practitioner, fabulous Tracy Reed, who is also out there as a means of support, because there's someone out there for everybody. It's just a matter of tapping into learning and having conversations.
And Jessica, I would say if somebody has histamine intolerance, like that is quite manageable to kind of figure out yourself, right? There's so many lists online. Here's like the low histamine food list. People who have histamine intolerance, they will respond very, very well and quite rapidly to removing histamine from their diet. Right. Mast cell activation is much, much more complex. There are many, many triggers that can be contributing to it. And you have to really work at stabilizing the mast cells so that they aren't releasing these chemical mediators all the time. So that is definitely, much more complex. Yeah. And I would encourage people to, so as I mentioned, my colleague Luca and I have been working for the last 2 years really, really hard on trying to create some resources because they have just been quite lacking.
Right.
So we, under the handle Histamine Haven, we have a website, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, And just a couple of months ago, we launched an online community. So we have a community that people can join. We have a few resources on our website, but we have many, many more resources in the community as well. And keep your eyes open for our book. It's also called Histamine Haven. We're actually thinking, we're super excited. We just came up with this idea and we're going to hash it out tomorrow. But we thought, we've had people say to us, can I just pay you for your rough draft? Like, I need the help now. I need the book now. So we thought we would just do a really small scale pre-sale of the book where people initially will just be like emailed our draft. And then when the hard copy is available, that will come out to them. So,
oh, fantastic.
Yeah. So if what I've been saying resonates with anybody today,
I'm sure it will.
That's something that's kind of our next thing. So.
Oh, fantastic. And that was my next question. Where can people find you? So yeah, histaminehaven.com in terms of the website, which would direct you to the other social media channels or online community from there, or at Histamine Haven on Instagram. Yeah. And ladies, you all know how to reach me too. And if you're watching live or on the replay in the Facebook group, you can certainly, we're not checking questions right now because we're on Zoom, but you can share your comments, reactions, questions about this as you watch it in the Facebook group. And I will answer them or also share them with Tracy to respond to them and make sure that any questions there get answered. Well, thank you, Tracy. I can't say thank you enough. It was a delight to have you as a guest interview and workshop this evening. We appreciate it. I'm just looking at the chat here. Thanks so much for the great info. I will look for the website and our Facebook page. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for having me too. It's always, for me, sharing this information is always just so exciting because I think there's such a need to create some awareness around this. And even, right now, long COVID, the researchers who are like the experts in mast cell activation are saying that long COVID is a mast cell activation situation. And so I've been actually working in a long COVID program from that mast cell perspective. So I think we're going to be seeing more and more of it. And yeah, the stories that my clients are struggling with, the lack of resources and the lack of support from their doctors, they're hearing things like, oh, it's just all in your head. And they're just being let down by the medical system, and it shouldn't be happening. So any way that we can spread the word is hugely, hugely beneficial for many people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I hear the same things. And that's, definitely mirrors my earlier journey too. And still, obstacles I run up against with my main medical practitioner as well. So it certainly is wonderful to have women in, our community, my community, your community, other practitioner communities to help fill in those gaps and direct next steps where we're being let down, unfortunately, otherwise. So yeah, definitely an important thing. Well, thanks again, Tracy. We're going to stick around for just a few minutes for any additional Q&A off recording. So I'm going to bring the recording to a close and then we'll wrap up. Good night, everybody.